This inaugural installment of Middle East Dialogues features a conversation between Bassam Haddad of George Mason University and Brian Edwards of Northwestern University. Bassam Haddad is the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. He's also the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute, the founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal, and the co-founder and co-editor of the online magazine Jadaliyya, which has been called an indispensable source dealing with the contemporary Arab world. He's the author of Business Networks in Syria, the Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, and the co-editor of 3 books: The Dawn of the Arab Uprisings, End of an Old Order, Mediating the Arab Uprisings, and Critical Voices, a collection of interviews with intellectuals, artists, and activists in the Middle East today. Brian Edwards is Crown Professor in Middle East Studies, Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies, and Director of the MENA program at Northwestern University. He's the author of 2 books, Morocco Bound, Disorienting America's Maghreb from Casablanca to the Marrakesh Express, and After the American Century, The Ends of U.S. Culture in the Middle East. He is co-editor of Globalizing American Studies and the editor of On the Ground, New Directions in Middle East and North African Studies. This conversation took place on January 30th, 2017 at Northwestern University.
Thanks, Bassam Haddad from George Mason and University and Jadaliyya magazine. We're thrilled to host you for a couple of days, and thank you for taking the time to have a conversation really about the role of public scholarship, and digital and print publication in this time. And you Bassam, you seem to me the ideal person to help us think through the role of scholarship, in the present conjuncture because of the energy with which and the number of projects that you've had. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
First, let's just talk about, today you gave a talk at MENA Monday in which you described trends in scholarship around the Arab uprisings. And along the way, you said many very interesting things about what scholars could do and the various positions they take within the academy and with respect to policy and so on. How do you think now, in 2017, at another transitional moment, scholarship about the Middle East and by Middle East-based scholars in the United States, can function in a world saturated with media?
To begin with, the problem historically has been that academics are removed from the public. They're stashed or sitting somewhere in their ivory tower and divorced from the public. People thought this was a bad thing because academics are producing good knowledge and sound knowledge, supposedly, and it should be shared, which is actually one of the reasons why many of us got together and produced a lot of projects for knowledge production that connect with the broader audience. But the flip side of this is that once academics also come out of the ivory tower, it is not entirely clear that they are always going to be doing this for the purposes that people thought about or what is considered good. For instance, a lot of the academics who left the ivory tower or spoke from the ivory tower to other audiences ended up being actually themselves used as tools, not to produce sound knowledge or to check power as journalists should do, for instance, but to reproduce power, to legitimize power, which is much of what has been happening in the past 20 years, with think tanks actually absorbing a lot of academics while they're at work in their positions or after they retire or as a replacement for the work to produce knowledge for policy, for politics, for empire, for power. And that has been, one sort of, in my view, negative development. The positive development is that academics can come out of the ivory tower, but also contribute to bridging the gap between what you see sometimes in daily blogs that are sometimes very good, in journalism, which is sometimes very good, but to bring that academic knowledge to a broader audience and to do it in a manner that is actually understandable and not off-putting, because we are known to be off-putting in terms of the jargon and language we use. But it's not, it's a mixed bag.
I've seen one of your major projects, Jadaliyya, which we'll talk about its origins in a moment, described as being post-Orientalism and post-Saidian. And I've seen you discuss how we've all been educated after the work of Edward Said. Can you talk about what our generation or the generations that follow Said's critique of the narrative about the Middle East? What kind of atmosphere it's been in to do the work of scholarship and narrative reproduction?
No, I mean, one of the things we actually advocate is that we have to become active rather than just passive. In this sense, for me at least, it meant that we cannot always, on the one hand, be stuck in the world where the book Orientalism is addressing the status of the field, which is important and, in my view, crucial. But we need to go beyond that, not for intellectual reasons per se, because intellectually we are still, facing the same issues, and probably in the coming years we'll face more of them. But for political and strategic reasons, and for what I call reasons of posture, in the sense that we were adopting a defensive mode, a defensive posture in addressing what's out there regarding the Middle East, regarding people from the region, regarding Arabs, Muslims, and so on. And instead of reacting to Orientalist views, to Islamophobic views, and so on and so forth, the posture that I think we should advocate is not necessarily an offensive posture, but definitely not a defensive posture, which means instead of just defending and responding to problematic claims, let us produce scholarship that is positive, that becomes a standard, that becomes a reference point, that becomes that forges a new path, that actually can be followed, that can be looked at as a source of inspiration. And that was the kind of turn that we were looking for, I was looking for, which we actually had manifested it in the production of organizations, publications, a set of conferences and events that actually pushed that direction. We no longer need to be, in my view, defensive, and we shouldn't be defensive.
So, if in 2017 we look back at a variety of kind of crisis moments for academics, American-based academics around the Middle East, whether it's the Arab uprisings of 2010-11, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or Afghanistan 2001, or even 9/11 itself, do you feel that the pressures, there's obviously opened up the world of Middle East studies quite a bit, and a new generation of scholars has come of age during that time. Do you feel that the pressures are kind of outweigh the possibilities for academics, or what kinds of pressures do you feel that young scholars and academics on the Middle East face right now?
Well, on the one hand, in 1991, when the second Gulf War from the perspective of the region and the Iraqis' first Gulf War from U.S. perspective took place, people like Edward Said and a handful of others were writing, and all of us were trying to follow them, and many of them weren't able to write in mainstream, publications and so on and so forth. Now you have everyone and their mother writing, and you have sort of a flattening of things, which is not so bad because it's democratic, but it is, on the one hand, confusing because you are faced with 100 articles on a topic, and you're not 100% sure what to actually believe, and perspective sometimes is lost. The impression of having a lot of information being good actually is not, I think, is not necessarily a good thing. So we have that change in technology that opened the door for many, which begs the introduction of scholarly or individual or institutional engagement to actually help readers figure out how to discern good knowledge production from mediocre knowledge production, from knowledge production that is either baseless or not well documented or reflects, someone's politics or simple opinions without much, rigorous corroboration. So this is, I think, what we are faced with now. And if we don't pay attention not only to the knowledge produced, but how it's produced, how it's politicized, and figure out a manner or set of criteria to allow us to discern the good from the not so good, from the confusing, the misleading, I think we will actually not benefit as much from this new democratic arena, which I support nonetheless, because to be critical of it is, I think, extremely problematic. Think about the time when only a few people could opine, usually males, and usually a bit elderly, and usually in certain cases, in certain spaces, older middle class white males, for instance, opine on things, even including gender. It was a really bad moment in history. Well, it's a long set of moments. So I think the answer is not to go back to anything of the sort, but to sort of increase the scrutiny, increase the rigor, and sometimes this requires initiatives, individual and institutional initiatives, to bring this to bear. Just like there is something called fairness and accuracy in the media, there has to be some way of trying to scrutinize the process of knowledge production, which is frankly what we, in a way, are trying to do with one of our major projects.
Yeah, could you talk about the knowledge production project?
Yes, the knowledge production project is actually a project that aims at organizing, collecting first, but then organizing and analyzing nearly all knowledge produced on the Middle East in the English language since 1979. Well, since 1980, but we went back 1 year to grab the Iranian Revolution. And it's organized in 8 databases that collect or that include the knowledge that has been produced within those databases, including books, a books database that includes all books, all 4 tiers, from the top, what's considered top tier publishers or knowledge
Published
production.
in the United States only, or
in English, everywhere in the world.
English, okay.
Yeah, so long as it's something that we can document, and that's one database. The other is peer-reviewed articles, all peer-reviewed articles, plus all peer-reviewed, reviews of books in peer-reviewed articles. So that's actually a 9th database that's kind of connected to the peer-reviewed articles database. All websites that produce knowledge on the Middle East. Much of the knowledge that is produced on anything right now is through the internet, and most people are reading the internet much more so than almost anything else. And it doesn't make sense to say, well, it's not always serious and it's misleading, it's problematic, so we shouldn't really pay attention to it, because this is where people are getting the news from, for the most part. So and increasingly so. So there's that, and then of course the 4th database is a think tanks database, which basically captures all reports produced by all think tanks in the English language on the region since 1979. Much of it is electronic. We're trying now to go back before the 1990s to capture the hard copies, which is how things were produced. And that database also includes the personnel within these think tanks and how they circulate across 4 kinds of organizations.
So what do you envision other than a massive set of databases and almost like a library of Middle East studies? What do you envision the knowledge production project to?
Besides those databases, we envision, like, we've added databases such as films, documentaries, TV shows, dissertations, and so on and so forth. And the existence of all these databases, what they do is that they allow you in a very quick moment to, first of all, see the results of a simple search across all these databases, something that you can do in most libraries or even Library of Congress. It will not show you everything at the same time, in a visually stimulating manner that actually allows us to think faster and allows us to progressively discover like a thicker version of our own research question, or even a better version of our research question, because you end up seeing things that you did not take into consideration. And you use this platform, which you could find, anybody can use in its beta form so far at knowledgeproduction.com. And you could actually not only do the research, but you can also trace the trends in terms of knowledge production. You could also trace the manner in which topics have actually changed over time in correlation to the change in proportion of females that have actually, female authors that have produced knowledge. You could look at a particular discipline or subdiscipline or topic and see how it was treated in a particular year, or a topic across disciplines, for instance, and then make claims about this knowledge production, including, for instance, how in political science in the mid-2000s, most of the peer-reviewed journal articles dealt with questions of security, violence, Islam, extremism, and terrorism, which meant that a very small portion of the production, relatively speaking, is left for all other topics. The entire universe of other topics other than these occupy, say, about half, or sometimes 60%, sometimes 40%, depending on the year, of all production in a particular field. That is alone telling. It says something about knowledge production, the process, the interests, whom it serves, and what is being left out. So in that manner, I think we are able to make claims that have an evidentiary base. It's kind of like looking at a lot of the claims made by critics of Orientalism, whether it's Said or others, and providing those claims with an evidentiary base that is accessible and that is public and almost indisputable, because all that knowledge that we have access to, everyone else has access to, and you can actually look at the numbers.
So it's an incredible project. I mean, at the same time as you are working on this enormous project and collaborative project of knowledge production and both the archive database and engine almost, you've been instrumental in creating new spaces within which knowledge is produced. You've been the co-founder of two journals, the Arab Studies Journal, and then I want to talk about the Arab Studies Institute, and then Jadaliyya. Do you see, so at the same time as there's this kind of attempt to catalog and study and to understand the major trends, you've been pushing those trends too. Let's talk a little bit about Jadaliyya first. Could you tell a little bit about the history of when that came together and how you and your collaborators in 2011 decided to start Jadaliyya?
It's odd, but this has a long history whereby when I first founded the Arab Studies Journal in 1992, I was a kid at Georgetown doing my master's. And then we always wanted to do something that is scholarly and everything of the sort, but we also wanted to do something that actually goes beyond the scholarly community, because myself and my colleagues at the time, in the early to mid 1990s, like Sinan Antoun, were interested in film, for instance, and interested in things that actually go beyond the ivory tower. And beyond the audience of the Arab Studies Journal, which was admittedly a limited audience because of the articles that are, in most peer-reviewed journals. I mean, they're kind of like a substitute for Ambien, this kind of like, sleep drug. To read a 40-page research paper is not something that, the average person is going to get into. So we actually were students doing our master's and PhD. So we ended up, creating this sort of network, informally speaking, which became formal with the years, that was interested in similar politics, in similar approaches, and similar concerns. And being in Middle East studies, it's easy to actually, identify what is needed. So we started a film and production collective that produced films that went all over the world. But then we wanted to produce sort of, in the era of blogs, something like a blog, but life got in the way. And I chronicle all this in a couple of places. The idea was to create a blog or a magazine or an electronic publication that does what the Arab Studies Journal does in other publications, but is accessible to the broader public. So academics writing for a broader public, which was happening at the individual levels with individual blogs. From early on it was Mark Lynch, Saad Abu Khalil, and just a bit later, or even at the same time, Juan Cole. There were individuals writing. We wanted to sort of expand this universe to an entire publication that addresses the broader public, which we ended up doing in 2010, because again, life keeps getting in the way. And Jadaliyya came into being as a function of 5 co-founders, which then became 15, what we call co-editors, producing for a broader public, and most importantly, which is one thing that it's very difficult to sort of replicate. It was not just about us living in America producing knowledge about the region. It was also a broad network that included people living in the region, writing about the region, and writing in their own language. First Arabic, a little bit of Persian, but later on Turkish as well. And you ended up with a publication that was quadrilingual, that is read in Cairo as if you're reading a local publication, is read in Lebanon as if you're reading a local publication, and read in the United States in a manner that has that much more legitimacy, addressing all languages, addressing things beyond foreign policy, because foreign policy at the time was sort of the website to go and look at for Middle East related material, especially what is called the Middle East Channel. But it was very much outside in, and it was very much connected or confined to policy issues. We actually wrote across disciplines. We wrote we published on social scientific issues. We published on literature. We published poetry, and we published cultural material. We addressed issues of gender and sexuality in more than 2 languages, specifically the Arabic language. So our Arabic section increasingly until today became an anchor. And we are, read again in the Arab world as if one is reading a local paper. That experience actually is extremely valuable to us. We're trying to expand that experience and reach more people, but you keep getting the same obstacle. The more you want to try to expand, the more you're likely to have to change the language or even alter the standard of writing, which we refuse to do. So after the euphoria, after the uprisings, the first few years, readership across the spectrum got exhausted. So you found a lot of websites going to the top 10 approach. The top 10 things to do, the top 10 things to read, the top 10 things to understand, and kind of the content sort of we feel took a beating and kind of got a little more superficial. We tried to maintain our quality, and we started publishing a little bit less than to just focus on quantity. And now, unfortunately, with the resurgence of various crises, whether it's in Syria, Yemen, and of course the current situation with the new administration causing a sort of a return to interest in politics and in Middle East politics and so on. Interestingly, many publications are experiencing a resurgence, and we want to be a part of this resurgence so we can provide an alternative.
What kind of challenges have you found working with academics and scholars writing for a broader audience?
It's always a challenge. I know for myself, it took me a long time to be able to write differently, and I still have not completely succeeded. The challenges are, in essence, first of all, trying to get academics to write outside publications that are, peer-reviewed or books. Mm-hmm. There is a conservative streak. Even some of our colleagues commented on it, in my view, in a sort of superficial way, in the sense that they were advising people not to waste time on writing in a way that doesn't actually further their career and so on. I think this is part of sort of an older world that doesn't understand how things are moving and doesn't basically have the imagination in many ways to envision a way of addressing the public in a manner that is sophisticated, that is research-based, and that is accessible, and that also influences their tenure committee, for instance. I mean, if that's what a lot of scholars are interested in, or a lot of rising scholars are worried about in terms of getting a job. So that discussion was very much part of the late 2000s, from 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. But it's beginning to wear off. You will see now some of the top scholars in almost all fields publishing online, and a new standard is emerging So that transition period confused a lot of academics who saw a rigid, bisection or schism between serious writing and superficial writing, and the associated serious writing with peer-reviewed journal articles, and superficial writing with everything else, including some books.
Yeah.
That is actually beginning to break, which calls for, again, more scrutiny on part of individuals and institutions and organizations in terms of figuring out which kinds of publications, which kinds of articles are actually contributing to our knowledge, rather than just muddying the playing field.
So when you think of the articles in Jadaliyya and their audience and the public that you're trying to reach, well, either do you know where you are being read out, whether it's more by academics or outside in your own metrics? And then how do you think about that as an editor or the writers as you speak to writers?
We actually follow everything on social media in order to figure out who's doing the reading and who's actually reading where. And our biggest readership in terms of the plurality of our readership is in the United States. And next you get, Egypt and Lebanon. And then, of course, you have England and the UK and Canada and some European countries and the other Arab countries. And of course, we do actually reach, interestingly, Latin America, Africa, East Asia, in ways that we did not actually anticipate early on. But we don't know the background of the readers, of course. I mean, there are ways to learn about this, but because of our content, we do not attract a person who is just interested in reading a newspaper or watching a television show about news. We attract more I don't want to say informed readers, because that's not entirely true. We attract readers that have a much more deliberate interest in the discourse. And the reason we know that our readership is largely of that sort is because of our resources that we publish on Jadaliyya that actually get a lot of readership. Resources, whether it's the media roundups from various publications in English and Arabic and Turkish in various countries, or whether it's the book reviews that we do, a variety of sorts of book reviews that we have, and the kind of space for announcements, call for papers, announcements of conferences, and we get a lot of readership that actually clicks on these pieces and actually end up using a lot of this material in their syllabi, which is perhaps one of the most distinguishing factors of Jadaliyya compared to, frankly, many other websites, is that if you take 100 syllabi from Middle East studies and you just look at the sources of some of these readings, you'll find that the publication that has the largest share, like the electronic publication, we're not talking about peer-reviewed journal here, actually come from Jadaliyya because of the manner that of the material that is published on Jadaliyya and its affinity vis-a-vis these kinds of scholarly syllabi. But with something that is also a challenge because it goes against what we set out to do. And therefore, you will see also a huge area of content on Jadaliyya that is actually amenable to a broader audience. The problem is that because of the need for clicks and because of the need for audiences, many other publications have actually, again, changed their standards, which is what I was sharing with you. We refused to do that, and we got hit for it because after the euphoria with the Arab uprisings, people were actually exhausted, so it took a lot for other publications to try to pull them back, but they ended up actually sinking with their content, or ended up being irrelevant, and that's why you see more than a dozen or 2 dozen publications that emerged out of the 2011-2012 period, also as a function of the existence of funding, are nowhere to be seen right now, or are becoming irrelevant. They just exist, they're just dragging.
You spoke today during the MENA Monday discussion about think tanks. Someone asked you about think tanks in Washington and think tanks around the United States. and you responded that that scholars and academics were in some sort of tension with these think tanks, which were instrumentalized a bit. Could you kind of give a sense of the role of knowledge production in Middle East studies centers and universities versus think tanks, and how you see them in dialogue with each other?
When I was a graduate student in the 1990s, I observed universities being a major source of opining for policy. Apparently, something happened in the 1990s, probably also a bit before, perhaps started originally in the Reagan era, with the conservative slant and the need for conservative institutions and sources of knowledge. We began to see in the 1990s sort of a move away from the universities to private institutions called think tanks, which became the source of knowledge production that was considered more conservative to compete with and compensate for what was viewed as a liberal bastion, which is the university, of producing knowledge for policy often. So we began to see the emergence of think tanks at a high rate, and the emergence or the increase in the production of think tank reports. That was pretty marked. If you see, for instance, at the Knowledge Production Project, if you look at the trends, you actually see that spike in the late 1990s and after 2000. And that became an alternative again for what universities were producing, which was, for the most part, more liberal than conservative. And then you began to see the opposite trend, because think tanks dominated much more so than actually conservative think tanks dominated the scene of producing knowledge for policy making and for policy makers and policy circles. So that kind of actually pleased a lot of the social forces in the United States that had a conservative conservative slant. So I'm totally like marrying these words. So that conservative slant is something that we still witness today. The most significant and most important and effective institutions in the realm of think tanks are actually have a more conservative bent. So what we're seeing as a result, in my view, is a degradation of the university itself, because it becomes less and less useful. And that, of course, brings us to another discussion of what's happening in the realm of universities and the neoliberalism that has hit universities, of course, worldwide, but also in the United States in a manner that I think is detrimental to knowledge production. You could see that in the past decade and a half in the proliferation of centers that proclaim to be focusing on academia and academics and scholarship, but in reality, in universities, because they also have to compete with this outside world, they're beginning to develop centers and programs that are very political in nature, and sometimes reminiscent of the Soviet Union and its universities in producing those centers that are interested in the national interest in a manner that goes above and beyond what we used to see in the 80s and 90s, whereby, for instance, security centers, terrorism and counterterrorism studies centers have been much more focused on politics, and a particular kind of politics, than the production of knowledge on these issues.
So, is there any reason to think that more progressive scholarship on the Middle East could not engage with policy recommendations or discussions? Or is it a kind of, you described an almost institutional structure in which universities tend in one direction with their own pressures, as you said, of the corporate, the ways in which academia has its tendency towards corporatization for private, and then kind of under the pressure for public universities of state legislatures. And on the other hand, the rise of think tanks. Again, you're based in Washington, where you're surrounded by a different environment than many academics in most other cities are, right? So,
yes.
Curious on your perspective on that.
Well, in the interest of being brutally honest, it is an uphill battle, and it is a battle that progressive scholars, and I'm using this word loosely because it means different things to different people, especially these days where a lot of people are progressive in relation to what is viewed as the status quo in the United States, for instance. it's an uphill challenge that I don't think progressives can win because of a very simple truth. Producing for policy or for policymakers and policy circles, if it is to be successful, it has to be acceptable and amenable to being adopted. So in order to be successful, you have to basically assume the interest of the powers that be. And if your fundamental existence as either a human being or a scholar or an intellectual is to critique power, check power, it is very difficult for you to assume the position you want to critique and give that position recommendations, knowing full well that you'll be discarded in favor of the next person who is very much in tune with this power center, very much in tune with the desire to reproduce that power and those power relations connected to it. So it's a very tough job. I wrote a piece in Jadariya as a part of a co-editor's roundup titled "The Futility of Policy Recommendations," in a way, because that dynamic actually wins over. Producing for policy is producing for the reproduction of the status quo. If you're against the status quo, you're going to be at a loss. You could still produce policy recommendations. I still do it. Many of us still produce policy recommendations. These things just sit on shelves. They don't really do very well. Some do. It's not completely futile, but it's an uphill battle that's very difficult to win. And the moment you win is perhaps the moment you know that as a collective or as an individual, you're doing something that's not, let's say, not entirely correct, to avoid saying you're doing something wrong.
Bassam, thinking about that last comment, I mean, it does seem that knowledge production around the Middle East is always fraught.
Yes.
Always has been and continues to be. And yet it's inspiring the work that you have done yourself as a scholar and editor and writer and with your colleagues at these publications. What do you see now in a dramatic turn of events in U.S. Politics, both with respect to Middle East peoples of Middle East diasporas and Arab American, Muslim Americans in the United States, and with respect to the Middle East at large? Do you see that that your publications will be under greater fire, that scholars have a newly energized role? Is there some cause for optimism as we move forward?
Well, the good news is itself part of the bad news, and that is the good news is that the bad news is that we're all going to be under fire. I mean, many people from different walks of life who in the pre-2016 world were not necessarily people that saw themselves in the same camp, to be in the same camp. Now they are. And I'm referring particularly to in a way, the Democratic Party and its adherents who are also under fire. So there is a potential opportunity for more interesting forms of collective action across a broad spectrum, a spectrum that used to include folks that many of us who do Middle East studies and who are critical of the status quo here and there felt that we are sort of alone. Because it wasn't just conservatives that we were debating with. It was also liberals or Democrats, if you will. I think this is the good part of the bad news. Nonetheless, it's not automatic. Those kinds of opportunities that exist today, given that we will continue in our institutions and organizations and our personal capacities to do what we've always done, now there's an opportunity to actually find some resonance or sort of have another set of or portion of the public find common cause whereby some of what we're saying will resonate. It is also an illusion to think that this is an organic sort of block. It is not an organic block. It is a strategic block in the sense that a lot of people, for instance, had Hillary Clinton won, we would go back to square one. We would still be arguing against some of the problematic policies that the Democratic Party, for instance, and its adherents have supported, passively or actively, because the adherents actually are not a monolith either. So, but it is an opportunity, and it is important for us to recognize that this is an opportunity not to change the world, but maybe to raise awareness regarding some of the structural problems that existed in the United States, whoever had won the election. And this is actually sort of the kind of political shock, in my view, that resembles, potentially speaking, the 2008 economic shock. One is vis-a-vis the question of capitalism and how it works. One is vis-a-vis the question of the United States political system and how it works. And again, it's not automatic that it will bear positive fruits. One has to actually work hard, and I think this is the time to actually work doubly hard, not just because of this opportunity, but because, frankly, we will see the emergence and continuation of a different kind of political system in the United States, where dissent has a different meaning than the one it did before 2016. Hopefully, it will not be much worse. But it is, as you know, tonight, like we're addressing these issues about U.S. foreign policy in the next few years, things are not looking good, and a lot of people will be under fire in a manner not just different from before in degree, but also in kind. I mean, people are already concerned, not because they have an opinion that goes against the status quo, but there is a proliferating existential concern now that, oh my God, I'm actually dissenting from a system that actually will not shy away from, basically engaging in a serious witch hunt that is not just about, opinions and different arguments and approaches. So that is actually a cause for people not to sit back and shy away from public engagement. On the contrary, it is an occasion for doubling up our public engagement and for establishing solidarity with groups that we have actually been in contact with or parts of all along, and with new groups and other groups across various sorts of cultural divides, racial divides, and even political divides to the extent that is reasonable. So I am, despite all the pessimism, I am optimistic about the opportunities that one can actually pursue. And again, it will not happen automatically. People like us and others have to push in this direction, not for the sake of beating down the other side, because you don't want to do to the other side what you're complaining is being done to you, but by providing an alternative, by pushing against really problematic policies, knowledge production, and regulations that are actually affecting us, all of us, I think, at some level, in more existential ways than they have ever done in the past.
Well, Bassam Haddad, thank you for taking time to talk with us and for all of your work in helping making these venues and these platforms and this dialogue happen.
And I must say that, I mean, in everything that we do, by the way, and I keep saying this every time I write or speak, it is basically dozens of people, more than 130 people in the sort of umbrella organization of the Arab Studies Institute that make all of this happen. Some of us are just more in the forefront, but the work of everyone over the years at the micro level has actually made this possible. So these are the people that actually also should be thanked.
Well, thanks to all, and thanks for taking the time to talk to us. And this is our inaugural MENA Dialogues conversation. So thank you for inaugurating our series as well.